The Old Man in the Sea by Ernest Hemingway, a book that I avoided reading in high school because it was so short and we were judged on page length. We had to read a certain amount of pages every single quarter or semester. But here I am, over 20 years later, finally tackling Hemingway's, I believe it's his shortest work in novel form. This is technically, I guess, a novella. And in fact, this is the only longer form novel I've ever written of Hemingway's because I've read his short story Hills Like White Elephants, due to the fact that I heard it was a masterwork in terms of subtext. I read it a few times. I didn't quite get how you could pull the subtext from that, but regardless, this is the last novel he wrote before he died, and it was published in 1951. But let us get on with the review. What is the hook? What is The Old Man and the Sea about? Well, if you don't know what it's about, I'm sure most of you have read it or seen the film, but it's about an old man in Cuba named Santiago. He's a very unsuccessful fisherman. He hasn't caught a fish in some 80-some days. He lives in absolute squalor, right? He lives in a shack. He uses a newspaper as a pillow. But he has this young boy, this young fisherman boy who kind of helps him out. He cares for him a little bit. But he finally goes out one morning. He catches a great fish or hooks a great fish, and it's pulling him further and further out to sea. And he holds on for dear life because this may be just the greatest catch of his entire life. So let us begin with the character. Well, the bulk of the novel we're dealing with Santiago. Like I said, he's this old guy. There's some great character elements here, right? The fact that he reads this newspaper and then he folds it up and then he sleeps on it, right? He lives in the shack. Also, he loves American baseball. He loves Joe DiMaggio, the player specifically. And those elements, or that element, is brought up in his struggle on the ocean, so I can appreciate that fact. Also, the interplay between him and the young boy, right? I'll talk about the young boy briefly because I think that's a very important aspect of crafting interesting characters, right? It's not so much the character in isolation, which we're mostly dealing with here, but it's the interplay between those characters. It's how they pull this information out of each other, how they interact with each other, that reveals character to us, and then we thereby hopefully empathize, hopefully care for them, hopefully are with them along this ride that we are about to be on. So while the seeds were planted here, and I enjoy the color here, like I said, I enjoyed the opening bits of it before he gets out to sea, because really this book is divided into, he's on land for a little bit and then he's at sea for the entirety of the book, and this book's only about 120 pages or so, I think, so it's pretty short. So really it's like two scenes, honestly. But like I was saying, I do appreciate the character bits that were seeded there, planted for us. I didn't really see those developing anything during the bulk of the book. When he's out to sea, there's some things he brought up about his past and Joe DiMaggio and so on and so forth. But I really would have liked to see the boy involved to some degree, or more so, or maybe at the end and the beginning, and we do see him at the end and obviously at the beginning. But I never felt like there was this nice arc happening. But what I'm getting at is I think the character work would have been far stronger if we would have had more time with Santiago and the boy, or at least had that relationship somewhat explored, even in isolation, right? Even when he's on this boat. And I just didn't feel like it was there. So even though the foundation is there, I never really was invested in Santiago, unfortunately. In the beginning, I found myself smiling because I enjoyed the scenes with him and the boy. But once he got on that ship, and once it was this kind of this beat by beat, arduous task of keeping this fish on the line, kind of lost me a little bit. And you saw some things there, though, that were tempting to pull some of that character onto the page for us to read, but I just didn't feel it. I didn't feel it. The short of it is, I felt like there was a nice foundation there. I just didn't feel those seeds grow into something substantial. But let us move on to the plot, because I've been talking a lot about it in the character section. And really, like I said, there's a small exchange, a few scenes with the boy on land. And again, I like to emphasize that I really wish that was explored more in this book, because it was probably my favorite part. And then the second part of the book, or actually probably 75% of this novel, is him out to sea. He hooks his fish, which is, I believe it's a marlin, and it just kind of pulls him out. He's tied up in his line, his rope. He's barely sustaining on other fish he has, and we're given a beat-by-beat report of this entire journey. But I didn't feel it. I didn't feel it. And I know this goes back to character, but I really wish Hemingway would have used a lot of these character pieces, right, to pull the character out of the actions and present that to us in a way where we felt like we were experiencing that. And I think there's a lot of authors out there who have done very similar things, where they literally pull us into the book. So we're right alongside the character, right? We feel what they're feeling, we see what they're seeing. And I just didn't feel like there was that intimate connection between the reader and the character in the book in this, unfortunately. One other thing I would like to talk about this book is like, okay, so I appreciate deeper meaning, right, in fiction. I appreciate themes, I appreciate metaphor, all of those things. And you can tell that Hemingway was doing just that. He was taking the journey of this man, catching this fish at the very end of his life, presumably, as a metaphor for just life's journey, right? Don't give up. Hold on with everything you have. Persevere. I appreciate it. I appreciate it. It just, again, I feel like unless the writing itself pulls you into that, conveys that in such a way, those meanings are lost, right? I mean, you can see it there on the page, but because it doesn't have the emotional weight, it doesn't have the emotional attachment, it doesn't sink in as hard, right? It almost feels as if you're reading a self-help book about these topics. And I'm not saying The Old Man and the Sea feels like a self-help book. What I mean is that unless you're emotionally engaged with this stuff, the theme is on the page instead of you being sucked into the page and it just sort of enveloping you, right? I think that's what we want as writers, is we don't want people to think about our themes or see what we're trying to accomplish. We want to just have people lost in the story, and hopefully our ideas we're trying to convey is absorbed, right? Through the characters, through the plot, through the emotions, not through the information, because fiction is a medium of emotion. It is not a medium of information. But let us talk about, I believe, one of the other roots of the problem I had with this novel anyway is the writing itself, or the cinematography of the novel, as I like to call it. Hemingway is known for attempting to write, the most perfect prose, the most perfect sentences in the simplest form. Strip everything away, all of the unnecessary things, and just put plainly on the page what is happening. And hopefully that simple language conveys all of these things, including character and plot, to us succinctly, and it's unobtrusive. I think that's the goal here that Hemingway had. He's right. He wanted the words to be unobtrusive. Now, Cormac McCarthy, another author I'm very familiar with, I'm sure was highly inspired by Hemingway because he writes in a very simple fashion. However, Cormac McCarthy manages to create the poetic beauty without it being purple all the time, if that makes sense. And so we tend to feel, at least I do, more attached to the characters, more attached to the plot. It's more of a visceral feeling. Whereas Hemingway, I feel like he separated us too far from it. He didn't let us dig deep enough, or he didn't dig deep enough himself to unearth these things that would hopefully attach us to his characters. And so while I feel like it would have been a great opportunity for him to use this really long extended scene of Santiago hooking this fish, being dragged out to sea, all of the pain, all of the torment, all of the struggle, everything he's gone through in a cinematic fashion, right? And I know this is an older book, right? People were continually developing their craft. So many people have learned from Hemingway and expanded on his ideas. But I never felt a sense of urgency. I never felt much tension. It was all written so plainly that it felt as if the action was unfolding at a very moderate pace. There are no clipped sentences. There are very few fragments. There are all of these things that you put together to create this cinematic experience. But what I will say is Hemingway did something very interesting here, because you'll notice that if you read a book, sometimes it's not very interesting when you're just reading prose, description, right? Narrative description. Where it gets interesting is when you're in dialogue, right? All of a sudden the story picks up, things seem to be going quickly. You're more invested, right? Because you're hearing the voices of the characters and not only what they say and how they sound, but how they interact with other people. So you have to wonder, what was Hemingway going to do in this situation where we have an old man, he's out at sea, he's completely alone with his thoughts, with his job, or with this struggle he has to deal with? Well, what he does is he has Santiago speak his thoughts, right? So we're given dialogue. And I do think that really helped with the flow of the writing itself, because being in this man's head the entire time could get tedious. And so I think having him speak his thoughts aloud was interesting. But does he ever say anything that is truly profound, that really, truly solidified some kind of interesting character voice in my head? Not really. Not really. I didn't really get that from it. So it's easy to understand. There's some clever stuff in there, but it's just too plain for my taste. I appreciate the idea of stripping writing down to its most base form, right? Only communicating what is needed. Don't have any extra fluff. I totally agree with that and try to do that in my own writing, but here, it was just too thin. And I don't think it's about stripping away words themselves. It's about the words you choose, because I feel like Cormac McCarthy, and I know I keep talking about these two men, but they're very similar in their writing styles. And like I said, I do know that McCarthy was inspired by Hemingway in his own writing. But the word choices for Hemingway just wasn't there enough to give me any kind of emotional attachment, unfortunately, to invest me in the scene, to invest me in the character, which is why I'm going to give Ernest Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea. This is really weird reviewing, probably one of the greatest literary books of our time, at least in the collective consciousness of literary analysis, a 7 out of 10. Glimmers of interesting character dynamics between a young boy and an old man, as well as what could quite possibly be the biggest journey of this man's life on a boat. Writing that was easily digestible, but unfortunately did not pull me into the fiction itself. But let me know what you think. Have you read The Old Man and the Sea? Do you disagree with me? I'd love to hear it in the comments below. And if you'd like to check out my own work and heckle it and judge it, please check out my books in the link in the description. And join my Discord if you'd like to tell me to my face how wrong I am about The Old Man and the Sea. But that is it for me. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.